I haven't had my last guest on for a while, and I miss talking to her because she always has insightful things to say about our culture, about our economy. Lynn Parramore is, in fact, a cultural theorist who writes about and studies the intersection of culture and economics, both of which interests me greatly, and she's written a number of interesting pieces we have yet to have the opportunity to discuss. So without any further ado, first of all, Lynn Parramore, it's been a while. Welcome back to the program.
It's great to see you.
Great to see you. And I wanted to start with the piece that caught my attention a few weeks ago, which was a piece on the image of the witch and Halloween, and which begins what Donovan might have called the season of the witch, for people who remember that song. And what is the deal with witches, witchcraft in our culture? Why are we fascinated by them? Why are we sometimes attracted by them, fearful of them? Where did it come about, you think?
Well, it's a really interesting thing. I noticed that a lot of the people who were persecuted for witchcraft in the big witch trials of, let's say, early modern Europe, the majority of them were actually women past the age of childbearing. If you look at the Salem witch trials, for example, out of the 16 women who were falsely accused of witchcraft and died, they either died by hanging or they died awaiting trial in prison. 13 out of those 16 were past their childbearing years. So it seems that not only have women been singled out in general for that kind of persecution, but older women specifically. So I find that very interesting. I'm a woman in my late 40s and not far away from menopause. And I have certainly been paying more attention and noticing how older women are devalued still in our culture. And a woman named Susan Mattern, a historian at the University of Georgia, has really shed some light on this topic in a book that she's recently published on menopause, looking at sort of how it's been treated and how it's manifested in human history. And it turns out that it's a very, very special feature of the human race. In the animal kingdom, there are only 5 species in which women, females, live long past the age of reproduction. In most animals, for example, elephants, even those that live a long, long time, they keep reproducing up until death. But human beings don't do that. Killer whales don't do that either. A couple of other species like pilot whales. And so the question is why? And it turns out that menopause and living a long time after childbearing has been an advantage in the human species. But unfortunately, in patriarchal cultures, which kind of become important in the agricultural era of human development, girls become devalued. Property tends to be passed down to sons. And so women become impoverished in those communities, and often older women are impoverished. And so they can be seen as an economic burden on the community. And that's one reason that they become persecuted as witches. Also, they are custodians of knowledge. They know how to do things. They have technical skills. They have skills in healing and in medicine, and they can be persecuted for that too. So there are a lot of reasons why older women tend to get targeted. They also tend to get targeted as witches when things are not going well. In a period in European history known as the Little Ice Age, that actually coincided with the big witch trials. Women, when crops, for example, are failing, women, particularly those that were marginalized in society, like older women, widows, they would be blamed for these, natural phenomena. And it still happens today. It happens in Africa, it happens in India, and even in our culture. We tend to talk about older women. You hear about older women politicians like Nancy Pelosi. They're frequently referred to as witches. Happens all the time. So we're not immune from this way of thinking either.
So I want to come back to the question, to the crisis in a way of the marginalization of older women and what that represents. But I just want to go back and reinforce a little bit why it was, at least in pre-agrarian culture, that menopause served an evolutionary function
Sure.
in ours and other species. Well, what was the function?
Well, it turns out now there's some debate about this, but it seems that there is some agreement, predominant among scholars, that females living a long time past menopause was a real advantage to our human ancestors because they could help out in good times by caring for the children that were already existing in the community. And in bad times, because they weren't reproducing, they weren't adding more mouths to feed. And they also served a function of passing on technological skills, like cooking, for example. We have this image sometimes that Stone Age hunters are what gave us the advantage as early human beings, going out with their spears and killing mastodons and so on. But it turns out that the die cast in our favor may have actually come from the less celebrated technology of cooking rather than spear throwing. That gave us an advantage over other species that were not able to cook because it releases more calories from food and so on. And when scholars have studied, anthropologists and so on, have studied hunter-gatherer societies both in the past and the present, they find that actually postmenopausal women are bringing in a large number of calories into the feeding of the community. The Hadza society in Tanzania are hunter-gatherers that are still living, and they have been studied. And it turns out that the men are, yes, they're going out and hunting a few times a year, and they'll kill a big animal, but often they fail to kill, and they don't do it very often. And if you look at the calories that are coming into the community, it's the women who are going out and gathering tubers, and it's often the women past childbearing age because they're released from the cycle of nursing and caring for young children. They're bringing in things like tubers and other plant-based foods, and they are processing those foods. They pound the tubers into food that can be more easily digested, and that ends up being the bulk of what feeds the community, not the big animals that kind of are dramatically hunted and killed a few times a year. And actually, some anthropologists have wondered why it is that these women in Tanzania in this hunter-gatherer society get married at all, because these men are kind of really useless in a way. And it turns out that there's something maybe that has to do with status and hunting, that a big strong warrior has good stories to tell, and he's seen as kind of heroic in the community, even though he's not bringing in as much food as the women.
So the hunting may serve the equivalent of a colorful tail on a peacock or something.
Yes, like that.
Yeah.
Something like that.
So we have this experience of, and we've evolved as a species for women to survive well past menopause and provide a number of useful contributions to the community in terms of both cooking and the transmission of knowledge and those types of things. Then we move into the agrarian era and then the industrial era, and women are seen as superfluous in certain ways once they pass their childbearing years. But there's still, and this is where the witch phenomenon fascinates me a little bit, Lynn Parramore, they are still, of course, by virtue of their age and experience, possessors and transmitters of information and knowledge. And I just wonder to what extent the fear of postmenopausal women as witches is, to a certain extent, the fear of whatever knowledge they might possess, and that those who persecute them are making them the other because they don't know exactly what those women know, and it's frightening to them and perhaps threatening to them. What do you think?
Yes, there's a sense that you get that in agrarian societies, postmenopausal women are viewed as unnatural, even though, as we've just discussed, they are not only natural, but may have been essential to the survival of the human species and the thriving of the human species. But they begin to get viewed in this sort of perverse way. And again, they are impoverished through the institutions of patriarchy, passing on property to the sons and so on. So they're disadvantaged in many of those societies. And if they become widows, they risk impoverishment in an even higher degree. They're not allowed to participate economically in the community. But even when they do acquire some independence or some wealth, they for that. So there's a sense of fear of women who don't seem to fit into the patriarchal structure in a way that women who are still bearing children do. And there's a sense in which they're out of the control of that patriarchal society, and they're a threat. And yes, the knowledge that they hold, they're rich repositories of knowledge. That has often been seen as a threat too. Their knowledge of medicine and in healing, midwifery, for example, all of these things become sources of questioning and persecution during periods in which persecutions have predominated. So yes, it is a fear that they are somehow outside the bounds of what is appropriate in a patriarchal social structure. And they are either seen as burdens or threats, sometimes both.
So I went back, it's so fascinating to me, Lynn, and I went back, because I'd written about witchcraft in 2008. And my piece was entitled, Somewhere Today in the 21st Century, a Woman is Being Accused of Witchcraft. And I went back and listed all the examples I cited. A 75-year-old woman beaten by a crowd in India, accused of being a witch. An 18-year-old girl in Africa who said that her grandmother had sent her to steal a newborn baby. Again, her grandmother, an older woman. Everyone, a 60-year-old woman in India beheaded last month by a neighbor who believed she was a witch. Saudi Arabia planning to execute a woman accused of witchcraft, also older. On and on and on. Not exclusively, as you say, even about the witch trials, but predominantly, the women are, in fact, of postmenopausal age. Nicholas Kristof wrote about a study suggesting there might be a link between climate change and increased witchcraft claims. Now, we claim that we in Western countries are beyond that, but I looked it up. The last woman imprisoned for witchcraft in Great Britain was imprisoned in 1944. Living history. And she was imprisoned because she was accused of divining from her son, who was in the active military, who died in a shipwreck, secret military information and passing it on.
Yes.
So, and really, I think it was a way to set her up because they don't know how she got. But still, it seems to me, is it possible that our culture could slip backwards? We think we're so enlightened that we don't believe in witches anymore. Could we actually slip backwards, and do we metaphorically still attack witches in the modern day United States of America?
I think we do. We frequently refer to powerful older women as witches. It happens all the time. And menopause is something that gets not only medicalized in our society, but it's treated as a disease, as something that has gone wrong with the female body. And it's really interesting when you look at the history of menarche, the onset of menstruation used to be viewed the same way. In fact, during the Renaissance in Europe, it was referred to as the green sickness. It was something that made young women sick. And, even in recent memory, it has been something that has been seen as shameful, something that has to be hidden and is dirty, or, something to be embarrassed about, or and something that is linked to young women kind of getting out of control. Well, we do that today with menopause. Starting in the 18th century, sort of when modern medicine began to take hold, and well into the 19th century and early 20th century, menopause was routinely discussed by doctors as a disease which caused things like nymphomania or hysteria or all kinds of mental disorders. And the treatments were absolutely barbaric. I mean, there was everything from toxic douches recommended to abstaining from love or abstaining from sex. Really, really terrible things. And we're not really free of that way of thinking. Even today, there's a whole industry around cosmetic surgery, which insists that women reaching a certain age are supposed to get cosmetic surgery to keep them young. But there's also an idea that sort of pervades the medical establishment right here in the U.S. now, that menopause is an illness that has to be treated rather than a natural process, and a stage in life that has many benefits for women, freed from the sort of cycle of, again, being pregnant or caring for children, etc. It opens up wonderful possibilities for women to be able to participate, say, in the public sphere, to contribute their knowledge and skills. And yet we still think about women past menopause as somehow being superfluous. And that's really ridiculous. And I think it holds us back as a society. If you think about the women leaders that have begun to emerge as patriarchy, loosens its grip a little bit, you see people like Elizabeth Warren. You see people again like Nancy Pelosi, who certainly are incredibly productive after they're past their childbearing years. I mean, Theresa May, on and on. There are many examples. Eleanor Ostrom, who won the Nobel Prize in economics. Toni Morrison. These women have contributed a tremendous amount to our society. And we need their perspectives and their skills in order to confront the problems that we have, climate change, inequality, and so on. Women who are past childbearing age are essential to tackling those problems. But yes, we could be slipping back. The fear of women who are not producing children is part of what lies behind the draconian restrictions on abortion that have come up in recent years. This is patriarchy reasserting itself. Women who somehow escape the bounds of being the producers of children are seen as a threat, rather than people who are very beneficial to society.
And again, we're talking with cultural theorist Lynn Parramore. And Lynn, there are so many areas I feel we could go with this, but one of them is this. If we want to, and I'm sort of exploring here with you. First of all, I was thinking in terms of the link between the way we treat, for example, menstruation and menopause. In both cases, there's a sort of sense, as you say, when a woman is moving into even or out of childbearing years, it's frightening and unsettling to the patriarchal society. I thought, for example, of the Dracula book and later movies in the Victorian era where, the blood, the innocent young virgin Lucy or whatever her name was, being exsanguinated by the vampire. I mean, there was this sort of frightening power that I think was subconsciously linked to menopause, and now we have the witch on the other end. But if we want to strengthen the role of women in our society and at a minimum make sure we don't fall back, and one of the things that has always intrigued me as I think about the right, and I'm just talking about the rank and file right now, not the people who manipulate or exploit them, the white, largely male people who are frightened and not sure why they're frightened, living many times in collapsing communities, opioid abuse, all those things, deaths of despair going on. And there's a link not just with this issue, but if you think about linking the issues of limiting abortion rights, making sure there's unfettered access to guns, and opposing immigration, all of which I stand on the other side of than they. But there's a consistent underlying fear there, right? Because in addition to whatever may be going on with women, those all have to do with preserving their culture and their way of life, which they see being threatened by strangers, being threatened by potential invaders, and so they need weapons, being threatened by a decline in the birth rate. And underlying all of that is being threatened by women, who to them are become mysterious when they're not in their childbearing years. So, I mean, I guess I'm striving for a way that there might be to reach people like that, or do we just have to wait until society moves past them?
Well, it's an interesting question, and a lot of this, I think, works in a very deep psychological level. There is a fear of women's bodies that I think is really a fear of the processes of life and nature itself. Mm-hmm. Women's bodies, when they bleed, remind us that we're part of the animal world. We're not these ethereal, transcendent beings, heavenly bodies, right? We're anchored in this world of blood and guts and animals, and that is alarming on some level when when you're thinking in part of a patriarchal structure where the ideal of life is to somehow transcend the body and transcend nature or dominate it and control it. So women's bodies make some people uncomfortable, I think, for that reason. They remind us that we're going to die, right? That body which gives birth reminds us of what happens at the end of that cycle. We're going to die. We can't have the illusion that we're immortal. So there's something very very, very deep, and I think it's entrenched in religions that have a patriarchal kind of context, and Christianity is one of several. But it does pass on this idea that somehow nature is something that we need to dominate, and women's bodies, because they're associated with nature perhaps more strongly than male bodies, are something that we need to control too. And I think, again, this condemnation of menopause, the discomfort with menstruation, the restrictions on abortion, all have to do with these very, very deep sort of tugs on our psyches.
And it's interesting that you mentioned religion and Christianity, because in particular, although other religions do this too, because they pair this sort of, the ones that appear patriarchal to you and me both, I would say, pair the sort of father god with, oftentimes they do bring in the divine feminine, but the divine feminine is not a postmenopausal feminine. It's the Virgin Mary, right? It is the Virgin Mary who reproduces without the messy stuff, the scary stuff that you were just describing, which is the power of sexual attraction, the mortality that goes along with. I mean, she's an idealized version of the woman, and I mean no disrespect to my Catholic grandmother or anyone else, but she's the idealized version of the woman in her childbearing years who does somehow have a link to immortality, and therefore doesn't remind us of death.
Yes. It's the Virgin Mary is such a fascinating figure for that reason. I mean, if you think about it, it's the most unnatural idea one could imagine, in a sense, a virgin birth. It doesn't exist, in the natural world at all. And to posit that as the ideal, I mean, there's really something kind of perverse about it. But at the same time, Mary is so contradictory because, she is shown with the baby at her breast and nursing. And so we get back to this image of a more natural kind of mother. And that probably is something that is, coming down through Christianity from older religions. Many have pointed out that the image of Mary with Jesus at her breast is very similar to images in Egyptian iconography of the goddess Isis with the baby Horus at her breast. If you look at those two images beside each other, they're arrestingly similar. So there is a hearkening back to religions that sort of predated this more patriarchal agricultural context in which the fertility of women and what was celebrated in the spiritual realm. And they were seen as, providers of abundance and symbols of life, rather than this distressing sort of either witch figure or virgin figure, which becomes the polarity.
And I've always been fascinated by the Virgin of Guadalupe in Mexican Catholicism, who is also an intercessor, right? She's also a mediator between the spirit dimension and the physical dimension. So I'm trying to figure out also, Lynn Parramore, as we talk about this, in what other ways we can point to to the extent that is possible in this culture, destigmatize and celebrate the post-menopausal woman.
Well, I tell you, I've thought about this question myself, and I almost feel like in my own personal case, again, being a woman who's probably just a few years away from menopause, to have a party celebrating it. Why not? It's something to look forward to. It's a stage of life in which maybe some of the burdens that have been associated with roles that get attached to younger women in our society, that I'll be freed from. And so I want to talk about it openly. I don't want to think of menopause as something that, has to be sort of whispered. And, I think really celebrating older women and supporting them and being understanding about the incredible relational skills and knowledge and perspective that they have to share is hugely important. I mean, in a sort of policy sense, I think we could pay more attention to policies like expanding Social Security, policies that would be beneficial to older women who still get penalized in our society and end up being economically disadvantaged in older age because they have been out of the workforce, for example, in many cases for childbearing years, and therefore their Social Security is a lesser amount. They live longer and rely on those funds more so than do men. And so being sensitive to the policy issues surrounding the thriving of older women, I think is hugely important. And, who knows, maybe at some point we'll actually have a female leader in this country. I think a lot of people could probably look at the current administration and think that the leadership of a wise older woman might be welcome just about now.
Well, I would certainly agree with that. And before I let you go, a couple other thoughts and topics, maybe Lynn Parramore. One is that the Social Security problem, we definitely need to expand it. We definitely need to recognize caregiving as something that should be acknowledged and remunerated, which we don't recognize now because you're not paying into the Social Security system if you're staying home as a caregiver. We definitely should have more policies, as you've written about, to make sure that men as well as women can provide caregiving. But for that party you were talking about, another thing you could celebrate is to the extent that the traditional family with the woman as the stay-at-home caregiver is a way for capitalism to exploit workers, you could also declare it an anti-capitalist celebration or the liberation of female workers from yet one more way in which they might be exploited. I'm just tossing that out there. And before I let you, there are a million other things I could talk to you about, but I never talked to you about your piece on the fact that digital assistants, Siri, Alexa, you name it, I always want to try to make a reservation for the train to New York. Hi, I'm Julie. That's the name of their digital assistant. They're all young women. They're women, and they are not postmenopausal women at that, are they?
That's right. In fact, in some cases, there are some companies who have produce digital assistants that have sexualized avatars to go along with them, showing sort of, sexually desirable young women. Now, why is that? Why is it that in our society we still see young women in this kind of servile position and in a sexualized way? I mean, that's pretty disturbing. And it is true that, some people have pointed out, okay, with Siri on the iPhone, you can switch the gender, but let's be real here. The default does seem to be, in terms of digital assistants, to be female, and sometimes there isn't a choice. I walk by advertisements for Bank of America here in New York, and they've released a digital assistant called Erica. I mean, on and on it goes. And I really worry about this. The Amazon's Alexa. When kids are growing up listening to the female voices of these digital assistants, one mother I spoke to recently said she was disturbed to hear her 10-year-old son yelling at Alexa and furiously for not providing the right answer to some question that was asked. What is this doing to the perception in young minds, to gender perceptions? I think that is something not to be lightly dismissed. And as a parent, I think it's something to pay attention to.
It's fascinating because I'm in my 60s, so I grew up in an era when popular culture, advertisements, everything else, as is well documented, was extraordinarily disrespectful to women, exploitative of women, used women in outrageous ways as sexual imagery, as sexual objects, and so on. And here I'm going along like something of an idiot, to be honest, with a Siri on my phone and everything else, celebrating the fact that at least for all our problems and gender imbalances, we don't have those ads where, the woman is treated like a rug and, or she's serving the man a drink and whatever, and it's supposed to be her husband. At least we've moved past those ages where a popular culture doesn't portray women in these sexualized, subservient roles without even thinking that many times a day, all of us are being exposed to exactly that type. Until I read your piece, I had never put two and two together about the fact that it is being pounded into our heads every day. And just as we didn't notice it in the 60s or 70s, we don't notice it today. And I'm not sure there's anything we can do about it except maybe boycott these products or let the manufacturers know we don't think that's the way to do it, huh?
Yeah, I really think so. And, in addition to, the sort of eerie feeling that young children may be getting programmed to think, to associate the female voice or female avatar with helping and serving. Imagine if you are, let's say, a female executive at Bank of America giving a presentation, and here pops up on the screen this female digital assistant. I mean, there's something concerning and off-putting about that too. So yeah, I think we have to be vocal about this and, make it clear to these companies that this is sexist, it's retrograde, it's really not acceptable, and that if they want to retain their female customer base, they might want to rethink that kind of programming. I mean, I think a lot of these ideas, unfortunately, are incubated in Silicon Valley, and we all know that the tech industry is heavily, it's predominantly male. And so the people that are creating these avatars and female digital assistants are probably mostly male, we could assume. And, we need to be aware of getting the message to them through their companies and their branding and marketing departments that this just really won't do.
So last question, what would an ideal digital assistant voice sound like? Would it be gender neutral? Would it be deep and mellifluous like Barry White? I mean, what's the ideal voice?
Well, there actually is a way to calibrate the human voice so that it is gender neutral. So in other words, you really couldn't tell from listening to it whether it's male or female. It is it's actually very easy to do that. And I would be more comfortable with that. And why does the assistant have to be either male or female? And why does it even have to have a human name? I mean, the little vacuum cleaner that vacuums your floor, what is that thing called?
Roomba.
The
Roomba.
Roomba, right?
Yeah.
Right. It's not the Rhonda, and it seems to work
Right.
just fine for
And
people.
it's not the Rambo either. It's just
It's
the
not the
Roomba.
Rambo either,
Yeah.
but it does its job. So I think it's really not necessary to make this a gendered kind of thing when we have technology helping us.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. And I would add to that that if it sounds human, then I have to call it not digital assistant, but digital fellow worker or digital comrade. So,
Digital colleague.
right. So unfortunately, we're going to have to leave it there. But as always, Lynn Parramore, cultural theorist, right? I can't say that word right. Theorist and writer. As always, great reading you and great talking with you. Thanks for coming on the program.
Always a pleasure to talk to you, Richard.